The Affordable Care Act, states or the federal government. Who's got the power? Following the passage of the 2010 Affordable Care Act, or ACA, also called Obamacare, 27 states sued the national government over the new law. Mandatory insurance provisions included in the ACA were viewed as an unconstitutional overreach of federal power, and lawsuits were filed by attorneys generals in 27 states. David Rivkin, one of the attorneys who filed the suit, said, "This is one of the most important constitutional challenges in history. The state sovereign authority is being trampled upon by the federal government." Michael Bolden, executive director of the 10th Amendment Center, argued that the lawsuit showed that state-level resistance to federal power is not just an old idea relegated to history books. It's something that's alive and well right now. Should the government require all Americans to have health insurance? While individual Americans disagreed about this question, the states and the federal government also disagreed about the state's role in implementing the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court largely upheld the Affordable Care Act in 2012, but the court agreed that the expansion of Medicaid was unconstitutionally coercive in requiring states to expand Medicaid or lose their federal funding from existing Medicaid programs. So where did that leave the states themselves and the future of Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act? Basically, the Supreme Court sided with the rights of the individual states. States could still choose to accept the federal funding to expand Medicaid, but they would not lose their other Medicaid funding if they opted out of the expansion. But it doesn't end there. However, the battle between the national government and the states did not end with the court's ruling. 19 states decided not to accept the federal incentives to expand Medicaid, leaving 4.3 million poor Americans without health insurance. 34 states opted out of running health care exchanges. States that refused to run the health insurance exchanges meant that the federal government had to do it for them entirely or at least in part. Deliberate obstruction or exercising states' rights. A few states have actively tried to obstruct implementation of the law by forbidding state employees to do anything to help that is not specifically required by law. Some of these disputes continued to work their way up to the Supreme Court. In 2015, a court ruling applied to federal ACA subsidies to all 50 states. The court ruled that federal subsidies to purchase insurance applied to all 50 states, despite language in the law that said subsidies would only apply to an exchange established by that state. If the court had followed a narrow interpretation of the legislative language, 6.4 million Americans would have lost their insurance and likely created a death spiral for the ACA. In the majority opinion, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, "Congress passed the Affordable Care Act to improve health insurance markets, not to destroy them." By deferring to Congress's broad legislative intent, the Supreme Court gave a huge victory to supporters of national power over state power. After the 2016 election, Republicans gained control of both houses. However, after Republicans had control of both houses of Congress in 2016, they tried to repeal and replace Obamacare, but did not attain enough votes in the Senate in order to pass their legislation. Instead, President Trump signed a series of executive orders, which were intended to return more power to the states and take the teeth out of the Affordable Care Act by eliminating mandatory participation requirements by individuals. This is an example of how federalism creates tensions between national government and state governments. The conflict triggered by the ACA, is a great example of the tensions that exist over how power is distributed between the states and the national government. This leads us to several questions. What are the responsibilities of the states, and what is the domain of the national government with regard to federalism? What happens when levels of government disagree on a policy? Can the national government simply force the states to do something? Is this how federalism is supposed to work?